Le Plaisir from 1951 is really one of the part of the last great period of Max Ophuls' career, where he returned to Europe and made 4 of his most beloved films, and probably the best-known films: Le Ronde, the Earrings of Madame Deux, Le Plaisir, and his final film, his first in color, Lola Montez. And in many ways, Le Plaisir, which may be one of the lesser known of those 4, returns him to territory that he had established through his entire career, dealing with Europe, very often at turn-of-the-century Europe. In this case, the film is inspired by 3 stories by Maupassant, and because it's a trilogy of short films, he is almost forced to distill interests of his and themes that have sort of carried him through his career in some of the most exquisitely economic ways, where the camera, and Max Ophuls' camera is something that people have talked about. Kubrick described it as something that floats through walls. The way in which the camera, in the most concise, with the most concise elegance, tells these stories, and in its movement sort of plays out the architectural space of the stories, the themes of the stories, the conflicts of the stories, and his whole preoccupation with spectacle as something that he both loves, but also is always trying to show you the cost of what's at stake in the spectacles that we love, the spectacles that we desire, the spectacles that define our culture, but also our cinema. And without ever being overly explicit, you always feel like he's talking about the cinematic experience at the same time. In the American version that I'm familiar with, it's Peter Ustinov's voiceover that actually narrates and introduces all 3 of the stories in English, and then you go into French subtitles to tell each one. He begins in the dark, and he introduces himself as someone who is perhaps sitting next to you in the dark. So you're immediately put right back into your seat. And while Ophuls' films always seem able to transport you into their realms with the most beautiful gestures and exquisite moments of camera work and cinematography, decor, costume, there's a way in which I always feel he's reminding us of the fact that we're sitting in this theater and that we're watching this confection, and that there is blood and history behind it all the time. Character emerges who is perhaps half of a puppet. You don't know if it's a man or a caricature from Punch and Judy, as the narrator actually describes. The story goes on to sort of tell us what's, how this happened and who this person is. But I think in the process, what you learn is that there's this cost to the spectacle. There's this cost to the beauty and to the excess and to the profusion of these realms that we're seeing. In this case, it's an old man who wants to relive his youth and his years as a womanizer, and he has a wife who has basically stayed at his side. So you see the cost on the woman ultimately. It's a woman behind a man in a mask who's there to propel this image of infinite youth, infinite pleasure that gets broken down and rebuilt every day. And the interior, and we are never going to set foot inside. And the whole opening sequence of this film, of this story in the film, is basically set outside its boundaries, among the men who are being shut out. It tells a story of the one day when the the house, the Maison Tellier, is closed. And it basically confirms this division that you see in American melodrama between interior space, usually associated with women, and exterior space, usually associated with men, and the genres of films that, basically take place inside houses are women's films, and the genres that usually take place outside, the Western and the film noir and urban set films and stories are usually associated with men. But in this case, the freedom that we usually associate with the men's realm outside is compromised by their inability to get inside the women's space of the Maison. The other scene in Maison Tellier that is amazing to me is the scene when they finally end up in this village and they go to the communion. And I think it's an occasion where a fool's who is obviously dealing with this wonderfully ironic twist on the prostitutes coming to church and enjoying every aspect of this ritual, that we can all laugh at and find amusing, and maybe is made more so in the Maupassant original story. But in this case, where spectacle and ritual are obviously of such deep interest to a Fools himself, and which you see played out in so many of his films, the scene is, it takes you somewhere else. It transcends the ironic, situation that we can be amused at, but not necessarily feel the, the presence of that spectacle, the fact that we are put inside it and transformed as a result. The third story, Le Modèle, was in fact a last-minute replacement for an original story, a different Maupassant story that he was interested in filming. There was a change of producer, I think, who encouraged the change of story. And Le Modèle has all of that succinct energy of something that maybe he didn't have time to think about or overthink, that he had to do quickly. And it has that kind of boldness of a sketch, where every gesture has to be meaningful. The first flashback scene takes place in a museum or an artist's salon, and you see the painter at work, and he looks up. This is all one shot. It's very concise. And in fact, it's funny in that, in some ways, there's a casualness to the performances in La Maison Tellier, for instance, and in this story, Le Modèle, there's a kind of, in certain fight scenes that exist between the painter and the model, for instance, there's an energy, almost a recklessness, that I don't associate with a lot of O'Fool's subject matter, that's incredibly exciting because it's still taking place in these continuous shots that move through. I'm thinking in particular of the house in the country that the model and the painter move to. And the one fight scene in particular that is so remarkable begins with a close-up of the painter going through the drawer. And another, extraordinary point in Le Modèle is really its climax, where the model who's been deserted finally tracks down the painter in the apartment of a colleague who's offered to take him in. And after they have their altercation, he says, she threatens that if he marries somebody else, she'll kill herself. And he says, go ahead. And she says, I will. You shouldn't taunt me. And he says, the window is right. She says, I'll jump out a window. He points upwards and said, the window is right up there. Lao. And crashes down below. It's the most unbelievable shot. And from where it begins and where it ends and what has happened in the process, its elegant, transition is so phenomenal, technically. I don't really know how it was accomplished. But There's something almost vulgar about trying to describe what his camera does, because it's only with the most amazing filmmakers where it goes beyond language, and to sort of try to stuff it back into words, you know, I think in a way is corrupt. And one should always just let the film speak for itself. If anyone is interested in what directors have to say, followers of great artists, fine, but you have to start with the work itself.